Chapter 1 in Human Growth and Development is largely a review from Psychology 101. So, as you are going to see, we're going to investigate what lifespan development is. So, the definition of development is a pattern or change of movement that begins at conception and continues throughout the lifespan. So this is what one would call a cradle to the grave course. We will encompass the entire lifespan. This includes the positive things like growth and maturity, as well as the more negative things, decline and dying. The view that we are adopting here is very different than the early developmentalists. They were stage theory focused. Big areas of development, including infancy and adolescence. Those two have not changed. They are still very big areas of development. However, we see the entire lifespan as important. We see that growth and change continues throughout life, and we see that each stage and age has reciprocal effects on other ages. So when we look at the topical areas of focus within lifespan development, we are going to look at how people develop on a physical level, a cognitive level, their personality, as well as their social. So when we look at physical, we're talking about the body's physical makeup, the nervous system, muscle, senses, biological needs. When we look at cognitive, we're looking at the changes in intellectual capabilities, like the brain, as well as learning, memory, and problem-solving skills. When we look at personality development, we start with temperament that babies are born with, that becomes an enduring characteristic that differentiates people from others. So interactions with others, social relationships, individual qualities. And when we look at social development, we're looking at the interaction with the individual and the social environment. Specific relationships, how they grow, change, or remain stable. There are individual differences, which basically means people experience different rates of maturation. They also reach different milestones at different points. And a lot of this is determined by nature and nurture. This is one of the largest controversies in the field of lifespan development. The four major levels theorized by Bronfenbrenner are the microsystem, mesosystem, exosystem, and macrosystem. I will show you a picture on the next slide that analogizes this to a bullseye. You'll see that the microsystem is the closest to the developing individual. The mesosystem is a relationship level, and it connects parts of the microsystem to the individual. And then you have the exosystem, which is a little bit broader influences. So this could be government, community. They're still influential on the person developing, but they're farther out. So there is a filter, if you will, of the microsystem. The macrosystem is the larger cultural influences that still have the potential to impact the developing individual, but they've got a lot of layers to go through in order to get there. So here is that picture that I was talking about. As you can see, you have the developing child in the center. The things that are most influential to that child are things that they contact every day, their family, their school, people in their neighborhood. And then you see the next level is the mesosystem that talks about relationships. And then you have the macrosystem that has more of the exosystem that has more of the influences that would be kind of filtered through the parents. So for example, the workplace does impact the child, but it comes through the microsystem. And then the largest level that surrounds it all is the macrosystem, which would be societal values, laws, customs, that sort of thing. So as I mentioned, nature-nurture is the biggest controversy in the field of lifespan development. Nature is all about internal inherited traits that are our abilities, our capabilities. These are things that we get from our parents. This does include maturation. And then you have nurture on the other side, which is the environment that impacts us, that shapes our behavior and influences who we are. So it used to be very much that it was one or the other. However, today's developmentalists believe that it's not one or the other. Instead, it's a combo. So it's more which one impacts more in this area as opposed to is it nature or is it nurture? So the theoretical perspectives that we'll talk about in this class mostly are the psychodynamic and the cognitive. However, I'm going to go through the theoretical perspectives that lifespan development can be studied through. So a theory is an explanation or prediction that kind of is a framework for understanding relationships, people, growth, all of those things. It could be anything that you're studying. There's generally a theory that goes with it. So the 5 major theoretical perspectives are psychodynamic, behavioral, cognitive, humanistic, and evolutionary. I'm going to talk a little bit about the ones that are most important in this text. So when we look at psychoanalytic, there are Freud and Erikson, and you can see the ages in which they theorized and the stages which they proposed the person was in. And then we have over here, Piaget, which was a cognitive theorist, but also he follows kind of the same time frames as does Freud, whereas Erikson has a very lifespan oriented approach. So when we look at Freud, it's good to know his history. He was a neurologist. He did study mentally ill patients, and what he found is that they would report conditions that he could find no biological cause for in the brain and the structure of the brain. So he hypothesized that it must be the role of the unconscious mind. So he divided that unconscious mind into the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is your very instinctual, driven, unconscious component that has no contact with reality. Your ego is the conscience, or I'm sorry, it is the only part that deals with reality. So its job is kind of to balance the id and the superego. And your superego is the conscience. It is that moral high ground of your personality. It is all the things you should do. And then when we look at his stages, they were divided into psychosexual stages. Each stage was based on a different erogenous zone. So the oral stage is for infancy. Anal stage is the toddlers and potty trainers, that sort of thing, which shifts into the phallic stage. And then there was usually a chastise or a punishment that went along with that. So the child would then go into the latency stage, and then eventually in adolescence pick up in the genital stage. Each of these stages, similar to Erikson, there is either a resolution or a fixation, so a positive or a negative outcome. So when we look at Erikson, we see that he was psychosocial, which is a more crisis-based approach. We had to do with different crises that people would experience at different age spans. So each stage of life had a crisis that needed to be resolved. It starts at birth and ends in old age. And again, you have the same positive or negative resolution that's possible. So when we look at Piaget's cognitive theories, the main concepts that I want you to know are schemes, adaptation, assimilation, and accommodation. So scheme is something that you're born with. It can be used to make sense of the world, and it is based on experience. It is a mental framework for understanding something. And the process of changing those is called adaptation. So we do that adaptation through assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation is when you are taking new information from the environment, and then accommodation is putting it in and modifying what you already know to take in this new information. So you're adjusting your current understanding to this new information that you are taking in. So when we look at Piaget's stages, there were 4, and you can see that they are based on ages. and then there's a description that goes along with it. Just so you know, that in each of these stages, there are multiple substages, so it's not just as cut and dry as this. For the purpose of the quiz, I really want you to know this one. I want you to know the main concepts. I will ask about the stages within the unit that we are covering that. So for example, in infancy, I will ask you about the sensory motor stage. Vygotsky's social cultural theory, again, a cognitive theory. He was very much adamant that interaction and conversation guides cognitive development. He emphasized the role of language as well as the environment. He believed that cognitive skills came from social relations, and talking was huge in this. His big concept that we will talk about more in the, I'd say, early childhood, school age, is the zone of proximal development, which exists between what a child can do on their own versus what they can do with assistance. The information processing theory is a theory that makes the analogy of the mind is like a computer. It talks about its capabilities similar to computer hardware, cognition, that sort of thing. And it is really focusing on how our brain and how our mind processes information. So for example, how we manipulate information, strategize about it, think about it, store, retrieve, what we put in, what we take out, that sort of thing. There's not a ton of coverage with that in the text, but it's still something that is utilized in lifespan development. This is taking you straight back from Psych 101, classical conditioning of Pavlov, where you're taking a neutral stimulus that is paired repeatedly with an unconditioned stimulus that becomes conditioned. Just think about Pavlov and his dog. Here is a funny video, classical conditioning at BGSU in the PowerPoint. If you click on that, actually I've got the link put into the Moodle page. If you click on that, it's a funny example of classical conditioning that will help remind you of this. And then you have operant conditioning, which is all about purposeful behavior, consequences that are going to change behavior. That could include reinforcement, which is a reward for that behavior, or punishment, which is a negative for that behavior. And then one of the last ones is the social cognitive theory, which looks at the relationship between behavior, environment, and cognition. This would be similar to Bandura, where he studied imitation and modeling, and how important the perceived reward or perceived positive that would kind of go into that. So those are your main theories. Do not feel as though you have to pick just one. Many people adopt an eclectic theoretical approach, and this means that they don't pick one. They instead choose the pieces of the theories that they like the best, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm going to end this lecture on theories, and then we will move on to the next one, which will be research methods.